Hello, all, and welcome to Spirits Trends presented by VinePair, the most read wine, beer, and spirits publication in America. Today, we'll be learning about consumer trends in the industry from VinePair's co-founders Adam Teeter and Josh Malin. The exclusive takeaways they'll share with you are derived from the recently released VinePair Audience Insight Index, a powerful tool that measures spirits category by category interest over time. So go ahead and take it away, Adam and Josh.
Well, thank you so much for having us. Obviously in these COVID times and not at BCB Brooklyn, which we are definitely missing this year, but can't wait for it again next year. It's like one of the highlights of the entire VinePair team's year. But we appreciate you guys figuring this out and allowing us to still present this data, which we think is super exciting. And so with that, I'm just going to jump right into it. Basically, it's a very quick presentation that's going to go over, all of the data that we have available to us to sort of, show everyone tuning in, what we think has happened since COVID in terms of the alcohol industry and where we see the industry headed in terms of trends, sales, et cetera, in the fall and into OND, which hopefully should help you plan a little bit. I know that everything's been super uncertain, but, hopefully we're going to give some insight that allows you to plan for the future. So before we jump into the actual index, just for anyone not familiar with VinePair, Josh and I want to give a little bit of an overview. So our motto at VinePair is that drinking is culture. We believe that, we all celebrate the experiences and the connections we make with a glass in hand. And so VinePair really, looks to create content that celebrates those connections, that culture around drinking. And we become, the largest lifestyle publication in the space because of that. At VinePair, we cover all three areas of the alcohol beverage world: beer, wine, and spirits. Seltzer also included in beer, obviously, at this point. And we talk to both consumers and the trade. We've become, over the last 7 years of our history, the brand that people trust to tell them where to eat and drink. And every month we see, about 4.8 million average monthly uniques, which again makes us the largest publication in the space when it comes to alcohol beverage publications, and is what gives us the authority to make a lot of the data points that we're going to share with you in a second. In total, every month we're reaching about 31.4 million people. That's across all of our channels, so not just our site, but also on all of our social properties, through our email newsletter, through Apple News, etc. And the consumer who reads VinePair is really in that middle to bottom part of the consumer purchase funnel, right? So they're either casually interested in alcohol but already looking to make a purchase, or they're pretty brand loyal. They know the brands they like, things that they're interested in, but they're looking for a little bit more information to really solidify that brand connection. They're also super intent driven. So prior to COVID, the readership at VinePair was really spiking Thursday, Friday, and Saturdays, which makes a lot of sense, right? They were coming to the site to read a lot about drinks when they were also drinking. We really have become the publication that's influencing what people are drinking and when they are drinking throughout the year. So without further ado, though, we're going to jump into actually what the point of the presentation is, which is the VinePair Audience Insights and our index, to try to give you a better understanding of what has happened since the COVID-19 pandemic hit the United States. So before we look at some of the trends, we're going to talk about how the Audience Insights works. So what Audience Insights is a revolutionary real-time insight into the wine, beer, and spirits trends in the United States. You may, if you're watching this presentation, be familiar with Nielsen and other sort of scan data type sites. We do something very different. So while those show you sales data, we actually show you demand data. Right? So what we've been able to do with our Insights product is actually predict demand. So you can see demand even if there's no product on the shelf to equal a sale, right? So we can tell you whether we see tequila trending, whether or not there's enough tequila on the shelf to equal the demand in which tequila is trending. And what we do with VinePair Audience Insights is create indexes of the 65 most popular types of wine, beer, and spirits. And we do that in two different ways. We do that globally, meaning all of these 65 types in relation to each other. So for example, IPA in relation to bourbon, but we also do that in relation to their own categories, right? So bourbon in relation to tequila, or tequila in relationship to Amaro, right? So that's how the indexes work. And we like to look at these in both ways because, first of all, the current consumer base really is drinking everything. We see a large majority of consumers at this point really code switching between beer, wine, and spirits. but we also see some people who are very category loyal. So it's good to always look at both. And so what these indexes are, as we've mentioned, is they are real-time indicators of purchase intent, right? So they're showing you the data, the marketer, the strategist, the mixologist, et cetera, what people are actually looking for when it comes to making a purchase, whether or not that product is on the shelf. So before we jump into some of the trends, I would love my co-founder, Josh, who built Audience Insights, to sort of talk about how we create this data in the first place and where we're collecting the data from, which causes us to be so confident in the accuracy of this data.
Yeah, so VinePair Audience Insights is based on two sources of data. The first is structured data about every article that's read on the VinePair site. So when you're reading something, there's actually a lot going on in the background in a structured way that explains what that article is actually about. What category of alcohol is it? What type of alcohol is it? What brands are mentioned? Contextual information about that. On a typical day, that amounts to about 225,000 unique points of data. So that is one bucket of data that goes into our data warehouse. On the other side, we collect data from Google Search Console. So in a very simplified version of this, whenever VinePair appears in a Google search result, whether or not you click on that, we receive some aggregated information about what people are searching for. When you add all that up, that's about 800 million times a year. And then we use some natural language processing tools to make sense of all of that data and get it into a way that fits with the structured data on the site. So we combine those two things together, and that's where we get the basis of how we produce our indexes. So yes, as Adam previously mentioned, this is not what people bought, it's what they want to buy. Now, for large products, obviously that demand is usually met, but for smaller products and perhaps seasonally, something like rosé in December, that demand may not be met because the product just simply isn't on the shelf.
So I think Josh brought up a really good point we'll talk about, which is this example of rosé, right? So, most of us think of rosé as being very much a summer-only drink. But in the index insights that we have, we actually see a very similar amount of demand spike for rosé in November and December, right? But you don't see that ever equal the amount of sales in Nielsen from the summer because there's not as much product on the shelf at that time. But there's opportunities to realize that demand as a smart producer, marketer, restaurateur, et cetera, by simply now holding rosé back and having it, in your restaurant, in your drinks program, on your shelf at your store, in the winter months when we know that people are looking for it just as often as they are in the summer. So with that being said, let's jump into what happened since COVID-19 hit and what we saw in the summer of 2020. So in the initial lockdown, everything was extremely quiet, right? As the reality set in for about the first few weeks that, holy crap, we're actually shutting down. This COVID thing that we've been hearing about that was, started in China and was moving across Europe and that was ravaging Italy and causing things like VineItaly to get canceled has actually happened here, right? But then by the end of March, consumers really started to storm back in terms of their demand for alcohol and also in their demand for knowledge about alcohol, right? So our traffic really stormed back, and May we saw record traffic, right? So what that meant is a few things. One, the cocktail library, which houses, our thousands of cocktail recipes, set new traffic records, right? That was already indicating a behavior shift. So what we're seeing, which most of you who are watching this presentation are probably well aware of now, is that consumers were learning how to make cocktails at home, right? So they had moved on from just the very simple, maybe vodka soda or rum and Coke, et cetera, to learning how and looking for recipes about how to make Negronis, martinis, Tommy's margaritas, old fashions, all these things that maybe they were only ordering at the bar because they started to also realize that they weren't going to go to the bar anytime soon. Spirits then, because of that, took the highest share ever in audience between March and May. And spirits is continuing to boom, as most people are aware. And rosé also started pretty strong, but then sputtered out. The biggest thing, though, that we saw also that most people are aware of is that champagne got slammed, right? So most people stopped reading about champagne completely ignored it, and for very, good reasons. There wasn't a lot of reason to celebrate at this point in time, right? Champagne to most American consumers equals celebration. And at this point in time, when, lockdown was really setting in, we were realizing that we were facing a pandemic the rest of the world was facing as well, there was a recognition that this wasn't the time to pop bubbles. What also was really interesting, though, that I think a lot of people have been aware of now that you've looked at Nielsen data, is that spring came very early this year. And what that means is that actually the demand for spirits and drinks that we normally see taking off in late April, early May, really started to take off in March and early April, right? So there was this massive demand for these drinks pretty early on, and we equate that to a few things. One, we think a lot of people were automatically looking for an escape, right? There was a realization, again, that these summer vacations weren't going to happen. So what did they, think of when they thought of summer vacations? A lot of people thought of gin, tequila, rosé, right? Those are the biggest things that really exploded. You also saw people embracing Prosecco for the same reason that it was, very much about escapism, but also that it was a more affordable bubbly, right? So people also started to think about, well, what's the future going to hold?
And these numbers, just to be clear, they represent year-over-year changes in interest in our interest subscores within their category for those months. So that's to say that, rosé in March was up 19% interest-wise over March of the previous year. Those are some really wild swings for such large players like rosé, gin, tequila, champagne, Prosecco.
Yeah, and the biggest winner, as you can really see, was tequila. That was up in interest of itself, well over 20% each of these months. Really, again, showing how much people were looking for a spirit that they, that defined escapism to them. Oops. So in addition to obviously talking about tequila as a, spirit on its own, the other thing that really soared was margaritas, right? So we've seen this reflected in lots of anecdotal stories that have been written, but we also saw it reflected in data, right? So with just one of our margarita recipes on Pinterest during those 3 months, saw 4.5 million impressions, right? So a massive amount of people looking for as many margarita recipes as possible. This is just one, remember, to learn how to make margaritas at home, right? Because again, margaritas for a lot of people in this pandemic have meant not only comfort, but also escapism. The other big stories of 2020 that Josh and I are going to get in together is first, Cognac is up triple digits year over year, which is massive, right? We're seeing this both in Nielsen data as well as in interest data. The interesting thing is that most people still have not been able to really break down why that's occurring. We just all know that it is. There's a lot of drivers there, we think, but no one's been able to put one, finger on what exactly is driving the Cognac boom. Lots of things are, but it's really interesting to see that it's continuing, that it's really, really soaring. Hard seltzer is again doing incredibly well, and we think will continue to do well through the fall. It's one of these categories that a lot of people counted out last year. Our data showed that it was going to continue to boom through the fall and winter. It continues to show that again. We think it's going to be a trend that a lot of people are going to continue to move towards. The one thing we think that's interesting about hard seltzer this year as opposed to last year is it's not just that it's falling into that low calorie, health conscious place, but that it's also, something that people are leaning towards because it's individually packaged, right? So there's this sort of belief amongst consumers that you're safer sharing hard seltzers with a bunch of friends than you are potentially, popping a bottle and mixing live cocktails with all your friends and potentially contaminating them and getting other people sick, right? So hard seltzer allows for somewhat of a cocktail experience with also that individual packaging. Tequila, macro lagers, Mexican lagers, Chardonnay, Cabernet, again, were very strong this year and will continue to be. Another thing that was really interesting is that gin had gains over the last 2 years. So it's really like shoring itself up. It's becoming one of those top spirits. And we think gin's going to continue to boom in popularity in the months to come. Vermouth, which I'll show in a graph in a second, also continued to soar, which again indicates people were looking for information about vermouth because then they were going to buy vermouth because they were using vermouth as a cocktail ingredient. So it further proves that people were really bringing the bar home, which is extremely interesting. We haven't seen that happen in this kind of way ever. Rum also saw an escape-driven resurgence. Rum has been struggling over the past few years in terms of whether or not it was going to actually break out. And we saw there be a similar interest in rum as there was in tequila, obviously not to the level, but people turning towards making daiquiris and rum and cokes and things like that, that again, made them feel like that they were on an island as opposed to sitting in their backyard 6 feet apart from their friends. And then a little bit of positive news for champagne is that it began to stabilize a little bit in the, in the summer after its spring rough patch, right? So we're seeing champagne start to stabilize and come up, especially the larger brands who we're seeing, an increased demand for. And then I don't have to tell everyone who's listening here that e-commerce and direct-to-consumer are absolutely booming, right? So massive, massive amounts of traffic to the site and then data in the indexes that showed consumers continuing to look for e-commerce opportunities and where to buy. So Josh, why don't you talk a little bit about Cognac specifically and this chart and what it represents?
Yeah, so what this chart shows is our tracking score for Cognac going back to January 2018. And you can see that, as of last summer, we started to see Cognac move higher. And then that really accelerated tremendously into this summer. So summer 2020 was actually up 123% over summer 2019 in terms of the consumer interest we were seeing, which sort of is apart from any sort of seasonality that you would typically see with a brown spirit like this. And we believe that a lot of this has been the on to off-premise shift. Cognac is definitely something where you can get a lot of value when you're purchasing it off-premise versus what you might be used to paying on-premise in terms of markups.
How about hard seltzer?
Yeah, so hard seltzer is obviously the craziest chart that exists. So no, our data, as we sort of hinted at, is a pretty leading indicator. So while hard seltzer finished off summer 2020 in terms of scan data up around anywhere from 100, 150% given the month, we were only seeing it up only 66%. So hard seltzer is really like harder year over year comps. Just came a few months earlier in our data than that are just starting to see over the last few weeks when we recorded this in mid-September in Nielsen scan data. Yeah, and then the big story here, agave in control. There's some interesting things going on. Tequila, no surprise, #1 in consumer interest for summer 2020. That's the same story for summer 2019, summer 2018. Mezcal has been, as anyone in the bar industry knows, on a long upward shift. The interesting thing for us is that it was about last year when Mezcal interest level started to reach broader consumer awareness. That's not broad consumer awareness, but broader than sort of being like the cool kid of the bar world. So it actually slowed down a bit this summer. It was still 2x 2018, but off a little bit over last year. And we think that is part of a much broader story that we've seen, that the big folks got bigger and everyone else sort of suffered as a result. Consumers went for comfort, consumers went for what they know, and that's not mezcal, that is tequila, that is amazingly already hard seltzer. We'll get into some wine slides where you can see that on the wine side as well. Yeah, so as I said, consumer favorites did really well. The one interesting spot before I go into that chart is that rosé did hold on to its top spot that it usually occupies during the summer over the last few years, but the interest was well off previous summers. We think a lot of that demand got pushed forward into the early spring. When you just couldn't go outside, you were in your house. So what do? You have a glass of rosé. So yeah, summer 2020 year-over-year performance for the core grapes were really astounding. Cabernet Sauvignon up 40% year-over-year, Chardonnay 67%, Sauv Blanc 20, Pinot Noir 20, red blends. We consider that a variety. We're talking about California style red blends up 23%. And when you look at what those year-over-year changes mean, Cabernet Sauvignon put in August, which is not typically anywhere near its strongest month. It's second highest overall month in our tracking series for interest. Chardonnay, it's third highest overall. Sauvignon Blanc, it's second, which was the first was actually the July of the summer. Pinot Noir, it's third highest overall, and Red Blend, it's second highest overall. And again, these are our interest scores. So consumers really flocked to what they knew and loved. And we've seen some similar data come out from folks like Drizzly pointing out that Cabernet Sauvignon really took share in a way that was even surprising to them for the summer months. Just something you typically did not see is, again, consumers flock to what they know.
Yep.
So yeah, as we talked about before, this huge behavior shift to home bartending. I'm not sure if you can see the quote with the screen over, but earlier this year, we saw that Noelle Pratt seen actual sales growth since April, despite the complete loss of the on-premise market. You can see the interest in vermouth in our tracking series just completely spike in the early months of the lockdown as consumers tried to figure out, okay, I'm going to make a cocktail at home, the classics. I don't actually know anything about vermouth. So they came to us for a lot of educational content on what is vermouth, how do you store vermouth, does it go in your bar, how long does it last, the best vermouths to buy if you're making a martini, all that kind of stuff. Consumers were just, unprecedented interest in. And even though that's fallen back somewhat since the early days of the lockdown, as consumers have educated themselves, the interest is still there, and it's still very, very elevated to where it was over the last 2 years. And yeah, as Adam said, we saw champagne stabilize. So you saw that March, April, just unprecedented low. Obviously, those huge spikes are the holiday season. But if you actually look at by August, champagne was back to where we normally see interest from a consumer's perspective in champagne. And I know we've been seeing some sales data come in showing champagne sales this summer, actually showing some year-over-year positive growth. So yeah, that leads us to Q4 2020. You may have seen the phrase K-shaped recovery popping up in the news lately to talk about sort of divergence in our economy. Everyone in our industry is well aware of some of the impacts that we're feeling that others are not. And we are starting to see some of that in consumer behavior, and that the big guys in terms of, the types, as well as some brands are seeing resilience and even recovery, whereas crafts and smaller types are suffering at that expense. As consumers have fewer dollars to spend and where they're putting it. And obviously within the world of craft, craft beer and craft spirits, losing those tap rooms, losing the distilleries where that consumer discovery can happen, and then losing, bars where, the mixologists, bartenders can recommend these new local products to consumers who may not be familiar with them. All of that has gone away. I mean, some of it has come back depending on where you live in the country, but that is also an open question of what's going to happen as it gets colder. So while we're not calling a quote unquote K-shaped recovery within alcohol, we certainly have been seeing and are seeing indications of some really diverging paths that are going to be difficult to deal with.
Yep. I think, the other ones to really talk about is these three at the end, right? So the biggest things that we saw in the fall are in the late summer are going to continue into the fall. One is hard seltzer will continue to be strong, and more people are going to enter the space, and you're going to have more people who are drawn to the category. And for all the reasons that I already mentioned, right? So there's ways to still entertain with your pod and have a cooler full of it and have everyone feel safe. They are low alcohol, they are low calorie. We've seen this massive flocking of people during the pandemic to buying Pelotons and, trying to figure out how they are still exercising and staying fit. And one of the things that a lot of consumers are realizing is that in those first few months, they may have been a little bit too decadent. They may have like baked a few too many sourdoughs. They may have thought a lot about, how pizza made them feel as opposed to, trying to have some sort of balance. And now you are seeing a lot of consumers who are returning back and saying, okay, I really do appreciate that this beverage is lower in alcohol and lower in calorie. A larger trend we think that will continue throughout this year as well is going to be more entrants in the space, whether that's seltzers or wines or RTDs, ready-made cocktails, et cetera, that are also lower calorie and that are very loud about that on their packaging, because consumers are going to continue to flock to that trend. On top of that, bourbon's going to be massive again, always will in the fall, and it's going to be bigger this year, especially the big brands, as Josh said, that people feel comfortable with, that they know. I think we're going to unfortunately see less of the craft bourbons have real success this fall, simply because, again, consumers, a lot of them, especially if we have a second lockdown, will be stuck at home and are going to look for brands that they are familiar with, that they've read about before, that they can find easily on all of the direct-to-consumer platforms. And then,
within bourbon, I can just add a little note. We're now, as I said, recording this September 15th. September is traditionally devoted to bourbon coverage on VinePair. This year, we put a little more emphasis on that. And just looking at the real-time readership data, bourbon is off to a sizzling start this month.
And then finally, Cabernet Sauvignon will continue to dominate. Right, so it's always been the most popular red wine in America. It will be even more this year. It will be the red wine that people are buying when it comes to the holidays, when it comes to getting together with friends, when it comes to Friday nights. It's, again, thinking about the trend this year and probably for the foreseeable future until we come out of COVID is going to be consumers turning towards the brands they know and the brands they trust and the categories they know and the categories they trust. If you have an ability to hold marketing dollars right now, hold marketing dollars back because you were thinking about launching a new brand or pushing in a new category, we would encourage you probably to do so at this point in time. If you are, though, in a brand that is in some of these very strong categories, seltzer, bourbon, Cabernet Sauvignon, et cetera, you should be spending because that's what people are looking for. And they're looking for the brands that they can easily find in the brands that are in front of them, right? So if you're the brand that's talking to them right now and really in their face, you're going to be the brand that they go ahead and they go buy because they don't have people recommending in the stores as much as they used to. There's, even more of a fear of talking to the person at the shop than there used to be, right? Like, please don't get too close, 6 feet. So they're turning to their phones, they're looking online, and they're looking for the brands that are showing up in those places to advertise to them. And that's our presentation. If you have any questions about what we have presented here, please feel free to email Josh or I at info@vinepair.com. We're more than happy to answer any questions that you might have regarding this presentation. And yeah, thank you so much, BCB, for having us.
Thank you so much for being here, and thanks everyone for joining us at Global Bar Week.